So the challenge by Ivan Krastev in his book After Europe is that political scientists specialize on European integration. We've thought a lot about integration, and we have contending theories of integration, but we lack a theory or even contending theories on Europe's disintegration. And if we're honest, we should have theories about disintegration, or at least trying to understand not only how integration works, but when and how integration enters into crisis, and when and how eventually disintegration may happen. You know, the Roman Empire, the Soviet Empire, Yugoslavia, there are enough instances in which you know, we've seen bigger towers collapsing than the European Union, and the fragility of the European Union as a construct should lead us to try and understand, you know, under which circumstances and how can it enter into not only crisis but into disintegration. If we want to preserve the European Union, we should also understand its fragility. It's not the end of history in terms of all the future, or for all the future we will always have the European Union, and we should take that for granted. We should be very careful about that. So we should take on the challenge by Ivan Krastev to try and understand European integration, crisis and disintegration. Part of the problem is that the risks of disintegration that we see and we witness today are embedded in the DNA of the model, on the original model. And without going a lot back into European history and European integration, I think that the decisions which allowed the founding fathers to get this process in motion, and which has led to enormous and substantial successes, contain the seed of problems at the same time of, you know, the seed for those successes. More particularly, the neglect of politics. We moved from an attempt to build in Europe from the top, you know, a top-bottom, and we decided to do a bottom-up process. We left politics aside in order to do economic integration. So we decided to ignore politics. We decided to work from the economy and from below, and therefore we postponed politics and we left politics. The finalité politique was at the end of the process. We needed to do it that way because we needed to transform the states, we needed to transform the nations, we needed to create a base in the economy and in societies for that process. But it is as if you push the problem and if you push reality towards the future, and one day that reality will come back and haunt you. And political scientists have been arguing for politicization for years, saying, you know, we need politicization. This technocratic construction cannot work without politicization. Now we have politicization and we don't like it. No, we have got too much politicization. Politicization can kill a patient which is weak or weakened because of the economic crisis, because of the Brexit, because of that. So the shock of politics, which has finally come, it's a very existential shock, because in the original plan it was always the idea that let's do technocracy, let's do depoliticize, let's do low politics economy and so on. So this is looking back into history, one part of the problem. We inherited that problem from history. So the process has entered into crisis, and I think, or at least I propose to look at this crisis in terms of a revolt of consisting of four elements. I would say that there is happening in parallel: a revolt of the elites, a revolt of the publics, a revolt of the markets, and as a political scientist, I have to say a revolt of the theory. So the revolt of the elites is visible in elites fearing, leading the process, becoming followers, showing that they're lost, showing uncertainty. We've left the nation state. We've left Egypt, you know, and there was a promised land of European integration. But 40 years later, you are in the middle of the desert, supranational democracy, the European Union as the United States of Europe, they look very far still. People revolt, but the elites also hesitate. And you know, what do? You know, do you go back? Is there any meaning or any possibility of going back? Should you just ask people for another leap of faith and move on? So elites have stopped performing their role in terms of leading. And this creates a huge problem, you know, and we see that it happened already in the past, but I think it's quite visible today in the lack of leadership. The revolt of the publics and the revolt of the citizens, again, for the last 2 decades after the end of the so-called permissive consensus on European integration, after 1991, we've seen that every time we put to test European integration to the public in referenda, it backfires. So publics have become very anxious about European integration, and there has been a lot of integration fatigue among citizens. The third revolt is the revolt of the markets. The main mode of legitimization of the European integration process has been through economic growth, and this is what sustained the permissive consensus in the past. When something works well and to your benefit, you don't ask questions about how it works. If your car works, you don't open the trunk to look what happens inside. When your car stops, then for the first time you have to find, you know, you don't even know where you open it. You know? So, but the economy was sustained in European integration, and the economy stopped sustaining European integration and started producing more anxiety and criticism on the European integration after the financial crisis, especially in 2008. And whereas in the 80s and in the 90s we had a virtuous process of integration center-periphery, and the markets liked liberalization and European integration, after the financial crisis markets have not liked European integration that much, either because it was slow or because monetary integration was not working properly. So we are in an era of low growth or stagnant growth, high unemployment, especially in the periphery. So the markets have also broken this virtuous relationship with the European integration process and have contributed to weaken its legitimacy. The fourth revolt is the revolt of the theory, and it may sound as a typical, you know, claim by a political scientist that we are very important, but in fact it is important, because at a moment in which we wanted to democratize the European Union, if someone enters into my office and says, I want a supranational democracy, and you know, I don't have one. I don't know how a supranational democracy looks like. We haven't done this before. I know how to give you a liberal democracy, even if I know that then, you know, it generates problems and so on, but the software for running a liberal democracy is more or less known. You know, you just need division of powers, elections every now and then, you know, transparent media. We know that in practice it's difficult to deliver, but at least we have a model. You know, you can download and then you can tweak it to your national context. In some places we think maybe it's impossible because of cultural, you know, problems and so on, but generally as a political science, if I'm teaching political science, I have a model to deliver. If I change my hat and I teach the political system of the European Union and you want a supranational democracy, I look weird. I don't know whether to do division of powers, to have president of the commission elected by the people, indirect democracy, direct democracy. Should we have 27 commissioners? Is the commission a government or not? Who governs in Europe? So we force theory to give us a supranational democracy, and theory has said, look, you know, I have direct democracy, and it happened 2,000 years ago, And I have liberal democracy in nation states. It happened, 200 years ago, and we are still figuring it out. Come back in 200 years if you want to know how supranational democracy is. To pose the question in terms of what I like to think there could be called like 3 revenges. There is the revenge of history, the revenge of geography, and the revenge of demography. Thinking that Europeans were able to transcend these 3 things because we're so great, as a power, that we could ignore history, geography, and demography. And this European dream, which was basically about ignoring the realities of these 3 deep-seated factors, has come back and haunted us. So the revenge of history, I know that there has been a lot of simplification in terms of what Fukuyama actually meant with the end of history, but he did actually mean that in terms of models, competition about models of organizing political and social life, history has ended, that there were no rivals to liberal democracy. Of course intellectually, but also even practically. And unfortunately, we're not so sure today about the fact that liberal democracy is a superior form of civilization, which therefore will lead it to stay forever. We've seen liberal democracy going into crisis. We've seen populism and nationalism on the rise. We've seen democracies going backwards or becoming illiberal, not in all parts, but in some parts, like media, judges, corruption, and so on. So, the jury is still out, but you should not take for granted that. Well, the Chinese, of course, think that there are alternative models to liberal democracy. Not sure to which extent what the Russians do is a model in terms of how do they sell the model. Probably it's just a survival experiment for themselves, but they don't export the model, at least theoretically, or in theory. But it's true that, that liberal democracy is into crisis. And with it, the idea that you could build the European Union as a perfect post-everything, post-national, post-state, post-modern, all those posts are now being removed. So we're going back to nations, states, and identities. And no wonder that Fukuyama's last book is on identity and the return of identity and on the strength of identity as an explanatory factor of things. On geography, Europe was built or developed on the premise that you could have an ever-expanding territorial logic, that you could overcome border after border, not only with the original founding members, but then in successive enlargements, but even outside the boundaries of former Western Europe, even into penetrating into the former Soviet Union, but also outside the world, that you could create a sort of Eurosphere with people that were like-minded, people that didn't care anymore about nations, states, and identities. So it was an ever-expanding logic, able to overcome all sorts of borders. But look at how geography has come back inside Europe, in our neighborhood, and outside Europe. Inside Europe, whereas 20 years ago, borders didn't matter in the deep sense. It's even, in the cultural, religious, and political sense. But now it's commonplace again now to talk about Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox Europe, to talk about the Hanseatic League, to talk about North and South Protestants and Catholics. And this is a crisis reflected after the 2008 crisis, which reintroduced all the stereotypes which Europeans thought we were free of. Spaniards, one day we were the Prussians of the South when we were growing, and we were so proud to be called the Prussians of the South. Who wouldn't want to be a Prussian of the South? It's like ISO 9000 certificate put on your everything you do, you know. So one day we were the Prussians of the South, and then, you know, the economies was again going back to all the stereotypes of siesta and fiesta, you know, and Spaniards taking long naps and having fun and not being productive and not paying their debts. I'm sure you've heard very similar stories about yourself. So, and then in the neighborhood, we've seen the return of the idea of spheres of influence. Geography matters. You should not enter into some people's backyards, or some people wouldn't want you to enter into the areas because they claim they have different values. We are not like you. It is okay to trade, but we are not assuming all the order that comes with it. And that means that enlargement has stalled, that the Arab Spring has not only failed, but but stopped looking at Europe as a model. And even with Brexit, we see that that Britain has gone back to the old politics of divide the continent from the outside, you know, rather than from the inside. So in the neighborhood, we've seen geography and spheres of influence coming back. And outside Europe, geopolitics is back. And this is a game Europeans cannot play or do not know how to play. We need multilateralism, not multipolarism. We've been writing essays and books about Europe as an herbivorous power, Europe as a normative power, Europe as a commercial power, or discussing about our soft power and all these elements of postmodern rule. But the reality is now more multipolar than multilateral, and more about carnivorous power and all type of power than only normative power. So where Europe thought that Americans would have hard power and we would have soft power and everything will be fine, this is not anymore the case. So die-hard geopolitics are back. And then in terms of the last element is the demography, the revenge of demography. We also thought, probably like the Japanese, you know, that demography did not matter anymore, even physically, you know, in terms of the sheer numbers of citizens that you could have. But the challenge today is that it's quite impossible to make Europe without Europeans. Without Europeans in the political sense, of course, in the sense of demos. If there is not a people feeling such, where is the European people? In the physical sense, you know, in terms of the demographic winter and aging dynamics, which are not compensated by openness to immigration. Contrary to that, by a refusal and a rejection of immigration, which deepens the demographic winter, and which makes it more difficult for Europe to be relevant in the world. And then with the decision of the European Council to postpone Brexit to Halloween, which is, I don't know whether they did it on purpose, but this, you know, trick or treat thing is quite creative in terms of the challenge that adds onto leaders. It reminds me of adolescents, you know, going around the door. This is what Theresa May will be doing on Halloween Day, you know, knock the door and say trick or treat. But even more seriously, in more religious terms, you know that it's the Day of the Saints. And my only optimistic hope about Brexit is that, as you know, in Mexico, the Day of the Saints is also the Day of the Death, is the day in which those who left come back. So there are two readings of the 31st of December, of October. Is it either the day on which the beloved leave, or those who left come back? So, you know, I cannot be more happy with that day for Brexit, for the deadline. Thank you so much.